Hi, everybody. Welcome back to a lecture on the philosophy of mind. And today we'll start looking at physicalism and how it solves the mind body problem. So, remember, the mind body problem refers to how lots of us think we have an immaterial mind. We think we have a consciousness that exists separate from the body, something that's not physical. And if you believe that, then you have to address the question of how does something that has no form, has no matter, has no physicality to it, how does that interact with or cause things to happen to a physical body? And vice versa. How does a physical body interact with and cause things to happen in your mind? Well, the physicalists are those who believe that mental states are ontologically dependent on physical states. So, what do we mean by all of that? When we think about what the mind is, right, we often think about our thoughts, our beliefs, our memories, our dreams, our feelings, all of those states that make up our subjective experience of life, right? So when we think of the mind, what we really think about are mental states. Right? So right now you're watching me, listening to me, so you are perceiving what's happening, right? You might have a feeling of it. You might have thoughts about it. So when we think about the mind, we're thinking about all of those things, the perception, the feelings, and the thoughts. So we call those mental states. So whatever those are, say the physicalist, those are going to be dependent on a physical state, a state of the body, right? Because for the physicalist, there is no such thing as immaterial things like thoughts and beliefs and desires per se. So, to the extent that they exist, they must exist as something that can be explained by the body. They must exist in a way where the physical nature of the body is more fundamental. And maybe this thing we call awareness and all the thoughts and beliefs and desires and memories and dreams and emotions that are felt must be the result of the physical body, right? It must be a phenomena that arises from the physical body. So, this is the general picture of physicalism. So, when we take a look for a solution to the mind body problem, then the materialists, the physicalists, are going to be maybe defining mind in a way that is different than what you're used to thinking about it, right? The mind isn't some floating consciousness somewhere. In order to explain what the mind is, the physicalists have to refer to the physical body to explain what the mind is, right? Not something separate and immaterial, but something related to the physical self. Okay, so the first approach to this problem that we'll look at comes from logical behaviorism. So, just a little background on behaviorism. If you've taken basic psychology, you learned that there was a branch of psychology, or is a branch of psychology, referred to as behaviorism. And they basically take a look at human nature in terms of human behavior. If you've ever studied B.F. Skinner and learned about operant conditioning or learned about classical conditioning, what we see is a study of human psychology from the standpoint of how humans behave. And this is in contrast to something like what we learned with Freud, where Freud discussed human nature and human psychology based upon unconscious processes, right? Desires, motivations. But if you are a scientist and you're objective about all of this, you can't see the unconscious. You can't see a person's desire. You can't see a person's unconscious or unmet need, as referred to by Freud, right? So the logical behaviorists come from this branch of science that's very empirical in nature. So when I say something like LeBron is angry, the logical behaviorists are going to ask, well, what can we know about that? How can we know that? Can we? How do we know about somebody's anger? Can you see what they're feeling? Well, Maybe because when you say LeBron is angry, what you're really saying is that LeBron has a certain behavior, right? What you're really saying is that LeBron has a certain predisposition to behave a certain way that we would refer to as being angry, right? Let's take a look at another example. When I say LeBron is in pain, I mean, if you're a scientist, what do we mean by pain? What do we mean by this person's experiencing pain? In some sense, we can't really investigate their subjective experience of it, right? What they're feeling on the inside. I mean, we just can't do that. So if you're a scientist, you have to go by what you can see, and what you can see is LeBron's behavior. Yeah. So what it means for LeBron to be in pain? Well, from an empirical point of view, the only thing you can really say is it means LeBron's going to exhibit certain behaviors, that LeBron is going to have a predisposition to behave a certain way under certain stimuli. Okay. Well, then for the logical behaviorists, they're going to believe that mental states is basically something we witness. Mental states is something we observe by somebody's behavior. In essence, mental states are behavioral dispositions. Okay, fancy term, kind of complicated, but let's simplify this, right? A behavioral disposition is the tendency to respond to certain stimuli in certain ways. That when something happens to you, you're going to have a tendency to respond in a certain way to that stimuli. So, for instance, if we say LeBron is angry, I mean, ask yourself, well, what can you see to verify that he's angry? Well, he snarls, he growls, he yells at his teammates. Um, it means that he has a tendency that when you say something wrong to him, he might yell back at you. It means that he has a tendency that when you look at him in a certain way, he's going to look at you with a certain facial expression. It means he has a tendency that when you say the wrong words, he might yell at you or punch back at you, right? That's what it means for somebody to be angry, right? Because if you're a physicalist, you're not going to refer to a subjective feeling, subjective experience, because you can't see that. If you're a physicalist, you have to rely on what you see, right? And the physical nature of the person. So if we think about LeBron being in pain, I mean, we can't see whatever you think of as being the subjective experience of pain. What we see is what LeBron is doing. He might be holding his ankle. That's how we know he's in pain. So pain must have to do with his behavior of holding his ankle. His mental state of feeling pain must be the predisposition that if you were to touch him in a sensitive spot on his body, he'll wince, or he'll grab it, or he'll yell at you for touching it, right? Those are all behaviors that result from this mental state of being in pain. So for the logical behaviorists, then, all the mind is, and all of these mental states are just behavioral dispositions. They're just the tendency to behave a certain way to something that's happening around them, right? So what do you think about this? What do you think about believing that mental states are just behavioral dispositions? And if you are saying you're angry, sad, happy, excited, that you have a memory of something, that you are thinking about something, right? You say those words and you say yourself, maybe you believe you're having an internal subjective experience of those things, but the logical behaviorists would say, no, 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 no. What the mind is when you say you're happy is that you have a tendency to behave a certain way. That when you say you are depressed, you just have a tendency to behave a certain way. That when you are thinking of a thought, all that refers to is that you have a tendency to behave a certain way. Let's take a look at some examples here. How might the behaviors transform the following sentences? Henry is angry with Maud. By the way, these come from a former textbook I used to use. Henry is angry with Maud. Well, a logical behaviorist might talk about the behaviors that Henry might exhibit, right? So Henry is angry with Maud might be translated to Henry has a tendency to yell when Maud says something. Henry has a tendency to throw his arms up in the air when a Maud walks into the room. Henry has a tendency to walk away when Maud enters from outside the house. Right? Henry has a tendency to say, "I'm angry with you," when Henry sees Maud. Right? So that's what a mental state is. That's what it means to be angry for the logical behaviorist. If I said Nikisha wants to become rich, right? Want. A want is a mental state. You desire something. Well, for us, when we say it, we might think that there's a subjective experience of desire there, that we feel like something, we feel like we want money. But I can't see your feelings per se, says the logical behaviorist, but I can see your behaviors. So when we say Nikisha wants to become rich, maybe that means Nikisha works really hard and to get more income. Maybe that means Nikisha has a behavioral tendency to save up her money. Maybe it means Nikisha has a behavioral tendency to not spend so much on food. Maybe it means Nikisha has a behavioral tendency to say the words, "I want to be rich," when you ask her what she wants to do with her life. Right? Notice all of these are descriptions of behaviors. So for the behaviorist, all that mental states are just tendencies to behave a certain way. Last one. Kenny thinks that Saturday Night Live is funny. Right? When we say thinking, we often are referring to a subjective experience, right? I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about this. In this case, I am thinking that. I have a belief that Saturday Night Live is funny. Well, we often think of beliefs and thoughts as something people can't see, but the logical behaviorists will say, no, no, no. When you say you are thinking of something or believing something, that just means you have a tendency to behave a certain way. So to say you think or Kenny thinks Saturday Night Live is funny is to say Kenny has a behavioral disposition to laugh when he watches Saturday Night Live. Kenny has a behavioral disposition to tell other people, hey, Saturday Night Live is funny. Right? Kenny has a predisposition or behavioral disposition to smile when somebody mentions Saturday Night Live. So what do you think? Is this all that feelings are? Is this all that desires are? Is this all that beliefs and thoughts are? Are they just the tendency to behave a certain way? I mean, it makes sense for a logical behaviors to believe that, right? Because they only believe what they can scientifically see and test, and all they can really see is what you do. But does that explain feelings? Does that explain desires? Does that explain thoughts? Is that all those things are? Let's think about a scenario. Let's say you go out on a date and your date is laughing at your jokes. Your date is smiling at you. Your date is um, has her eyes attached to you in such a way that seems to indicate she's engaged with what you are doing. If you're a logical behaviorist, you would say those behaviors are that person's mental state. That having eyes locked onto you and smiling at what you're saying and laughing at your jokes, I mean, that indicates their mental state. But wait a minute. Can you imagine being on another date that where they do the exact same thing, but they may have a different mental state than your original date? Think about it this way. If you see somebody with their eyes locked on you, that's smiling at everything you say, and that's laughing at all your jokes, you might say to yourself, "Oh my gosh, she really likes me," right? And you're ascribing to them the mental state that they're attracted to. You're ascribing them to the mental state that they're really enjoying this date. But is that necessarily true? Isn't it possible that this person is only doing those things because they're being nice to you? Isn't it true that maybe this person is only doing those things because they feel bad for you? Isn't it possible they're only doing these things because they have a sense of ethics and morality that says, I can't let this guy feel bad about himself, so I'll smile and laugh and nod? And isn't that possible that she's or he's just doing those things for some other reason than they like you. Sorry to say. What this points out to is an objection from insincerity, right? I mean, you can have two people have the exact same behaviors, but they don't necessarily have the same mental state. If you're a logical behaviorist, that's a problem, right? Because all a mental state is are the tendency to have those behaviors. But if you can imagine two people doing the exact same things for different reasons, well, then those reasons are a mental state, right? The person that's laughing and smiling and nodding because they feel ethically obliged to do that, well, then that sense of ethics is a mental state, right? Their mind says to themselves, it's a good thing to be nice to this person, right? They have a mental state that says, oh, I feel bad for them. I don't want them to feel bad about themselves, so I'll just play along, right? Or they may have a mental state that says, I should be having a good time for myself, despite how awful this conversation is. I better just might as well smile. All of those things we refer to as mental states can't just be explained away as a behavioral disposition, right? So there seems to be something more internal. It's not that your jokes, right, and what you're saying is causing them to behave a certain way. That's not the only thing that's caused them to behave. It seems to be there's something inside of them that's also causing them to behave, right? There's the there's the feeling or the thought that they should be nice. There's the feeling or the thought that they should try to enjoy themselves. There's the feeling or the thought that's only polite to smile and laugh and engage, you know, in eye contact. So there must be some other internal state, right? There must be something else inside that's influencing them to smile and laugh and to engage with your eyes. That doesn't seem to be explained away with logical behaviorism. So here's a formal argument that you could use to object to behaviorism. P1, if behaviorism is true, it is not possible for there to be a perfect actor or doppelganger who behaves just like me but has different mental states or none at all. P2, but it is possible for there to be a perfect actor or doppelganger who behaves just like me but has different mental states or none at all. Okay, so to bring an example to make sense of the argument, right? You could react to somebody and yell and throw your hands up in the air, right? Things that we typically refer to as anger. Somebody else could yell, throw their hands up in the air, have the exact same behaviors, but will be doing it for different reasons. Instead of being angry, maybe they're just mimicking you. They just want to make fun of you. Instead of being angry, maybe they're just um, um, exercising, right? Their ability to use their body. I mean, there could be lots of reasons why they may have behaviors that are similar to yours. But for the logical behaviorists, that's not possible because whatever behaviors you do, must be the result of a mental state. So if they have the same behaviors, they must have the same mental state, according to a logical behaviorist. But as we just demonstrated, you don't have to have the same mental state as somebody to have the same behaviors. Therefore, behaviorism is not true. Okay, so we have another theory referred to as the identity theory that takes into account internal states, right? You are not just a robot that's reacting to the world, you also are reacting to your own internal states. Well, let's delve into this a little bit more. What does identity theory say? They believe that mental states are actually identical to brain states, right? Because the brain is internal to you. So your mental states are identical to your brain states. Okay, so let's hammer out what this means. There's a famous case of Phineas Gage, and if you've ever taken basic psychology, you've maybe heard of Phineas Gage. He was, for all intents and purposes, a nice man. He was courteous and polite and treated people well and, was very friendly. He worked on the railroads and laying down the tracks for the railroad tracks. And at some point in his life, was victim to a horrific accident where a pole, a rod, went through his head. right? It was a medical miracle that he was able to actually survive that. But after the accident, his temperament changed, his personality changed. His behavior was no longer one that you'd classify as friendly and, fun to be around. He was grumpy and, mean and not fun to be around. Well, the obvious explanation is that the injury to his brain caused him to have a different mind, that the injury to his brain caused him to have different mental states. This seems to imply then that the mind is really caused by your brain, that whatever you refer to as a mental state is really something your brain is doing. And we can see this correlation. We can stimulate certain parts of your brain, and then all of a sudden you have an image pop up, or all of a sudden you have a memory pop up, or all of a sudden you have a desire for something that didn't have a desire for before, simply because we physically interacted with your brain. We can either stimulate it with some sort of electric stimulus. We can alter your brain, like physically, yeah, uh, uh, carve out sections of your brain, and all of a sudden your personality is different. All of a sudden your thoughts are different, right? So there seems to be this strong correlation where some state of your brain must be the cause for a certain state of your mind, right? We can take a look at studies where we put people in machines to see what their brain is doing, and then we could map people's emotions, people's thoughts, people's feelings. So when you are feeling compassionate, we can see what your brain is doing. And then when you're feeling angry, we can see what your brain is doing. There's that correlation there. And we know that people that have certain states of mind that are maybe anxious, maybe have a hard time concentrating, maybe people that feel certain, levels of depression, that we can change that by changing the brain chemistry, right? We give people certain medications that change the brain chemistry and that changes their mind. So that sort of implies that whatever the mind is, it's really just something your brain is doing, right? We can take a look at people and put them in machines, hook up their brains to EEG machines, where we can measure the electromagnetic activity of the brain. So if you don't know what that refers to, right, the brain is made up of brain cells called neurons, and they're all connected to one another in a big network of neurons. That connection has electrical communication going between them and chemical communication going between them. So we can measure the electrical communication. We can see the activity of your brain, right? We can measure the electrical activity. And, we can see the activity. And if it's a certain way, we know you're sleepy. We can see the activity. If it's a certain way, we know you're just like super relaxed. We can see the activity, and you don't have to tell us anything. You don't have to do anything, but we can tell that you're anxious about something, that you're really thinking hard about something, right? And we can see that physically on a machine. That seems to indicate that whatever you call a mental state is really something your brain is doing. That whatever the state is of your brain at a certain point, right? Meaning, what chemicals are being released, how many of them, how much communication is being had between certain neurons and certain parts of your brain, whatever that state is of your brain, I mean, that must be what a mental state is, right? So to feel happy is whatever your brain is doing at that time. If you take a picture of it, that's what it means to be happy. It's what your brain, what the state is at the time you're happy. When you say you're thinking about your mom, what that is the state of your brain, right? When you're thinking about your mom, the neurons that are communicating to one another and the chemicals that are being released. That's what it means when you say you're thinking about your mom. Mental states are brain states. So let's identify the argument for this theory. First premise, mental states, desires, beliefs, feelings, experiences, they're all affected by physical damage to your brain, right? We've seen this countless times. Think about anybody you know that's had a stroke, right? Or think about anybody you know that's had lack of sleep, or it's gone through an accident, or been intoxicated, right? P2, mental states seem to correlate with brain states. And when people have had those accidents, have had issues with intoxication, we can see that they have certain feelings, they have certain experiences, right? So it feels as if when something happens to the brain, it affects what you think, what you feel. It affects your mental state. Therefore, mental states are identical to brain states, right? All your thoughts, desires, feelings, your experiences, your memories, your dreams, those aren't something outside of your body. That's not something that exists immaterially, like the cart would have you think. No, no, no. Whatever that is, it's just what your brain is doing, right? Being happy is a state of the brain. Being sad is a state of the brain. Thinking about this philosophy is a state of your brain, right? This is how the identity theorists would explain this. In other words, as I've been mentioning, the mind is what the brain does. Okay? So, what are some objections you might have to this theory? What are some, if you are a dualist or if you're an immaterialist, what are some things you might say to the identity theory's philosophy and what they presented to you so far? I mean, one thing you might say is, yeah, it shows that these two things are correlated. Your brain is correlated to your mind, that when you affect something in the brain, it somehow has a relationship with your mind. But that does not prove that the brain is causing your mind. That whatever the mind is just what your brain is doing. It doesn't prove that. It just shows that they're related to one another. We can think about a marketplace, right? Like the mall. And when you go to buy pants at Macy's, it's a certain price. And when you go to buy pants at Target, it's a certain price. Another day you go in, you notice that the price at Macy's for the pants went up, and you go to Target and you notice, hey, the price for pants there also went up. Well, there could be for some reason, a way to explain how they're correlated, right? That the rising in pants prices at Macy's are somehow related to the reason why pants prices are rising at Target. But it doesn't mean one caused the other. It doesn't mean that when Macy's changed the price, that caused Target to change the price. I mean, they could change the price because the cost of materials has changed, right? They could both be changing the price at the same time because maybe the tax rate for the state went up. They might be both raising their pants price at the same time because there are new restrictions on goods imported from wherever the pants were manufactured, right? So just because those two things have a relationship, the cost of pants at Target and cost of pants at Macy's, just because they're related somehow, it doesn't mean one is causing the other. So with identity theory, just because stuff that happens to the brain seems to correlate with things happening in the mind, it doesn't necessarily mean one is causing the other, that the mind is the result of the brain, that the brain causes the mind. It just could be that they're related somehow, right? Two, well, identity theory posits that your mental states are just brain states, right? But can't you imagine over time, we live in Silicon Valley, that some company around here is going to invent something that could replace a part of your brain when you get older and have memory loss, and then you can keep your memories? Or that when you have some sort of aneurysm and certain cells die in a certain part of your brain, that you can buy a silicon chip, right? A computer chip to put in there to replace that dead brain cell, and you could retain, majority of what you think of as being your personality and your thoughts and feelings and beliefs. Can't you imagine that as you get older and certain parts of your brain get weaker, like for hearing or for sight, that you can eventually purchase some synthetic hardware to replace that part of your brain? I mean, that's not outside the realm of possibility. We're doing things that are similar to that now. Well, if that's true, then you can imagine possibly your brain no longer really being your brain just being comprised of hardware, right? Isn't that possible? In which case, it's not really the fact that it's a brain state that makes the mind, but it's that whatever physically is in here functions in a way that, you know, results in the same sorts of behaviors that you call mind inspired behaviors now, right? That you can replace all of this with synthetics, but as long as you do the same things, have the same thoughts, have the same desires, have the same motivations, and you go out for the burger and you yell at somebody when you're angry and you laugh when you see Saturday Night Live, it doesn't really matter that it's a brain in there as long as it functions like your brain. Similarly, maybe you can imagine a species or an alien um, species that doesn't even have anything that resembles a brain, yet it still has what we call feelings and desires and behaviors. Isn't that possible? That you can open up some creature? It's horrible to say open up a creature, right? But you can open up some creature and they don't have anything that resembles a brain, yet they'll have behaviors that correspond to what we think of as being, the results of mental states. Well, then, maybe it's a simple change. Maybe there's a simple way of addressing these problems. Because for a lot of us, identity theory is intuitive, right? Yeah, that makes sense. My mind is something the brain is doing. My mind is some immaterial conscience or soul. My mind is just the result of brain activity. Well, there's a simple answer to this problem, right? These objections to identity theory. And that's going to come in the form of functionalism. Instead of thinking about mental states as related to brain states per se, instead of thinking about the mind in terms of what it's made out of, brain stuff, maybe we can think of the mind in terms of its function. Maybe we can relate to the mind in terms of what it does for you. So when we come back next class, we'll take a look at this functional theory of mind and discuss, wait a minute, if I can imagine my brain being completely replaced with synthetic components, does that mean a computer can have a mind? Well, for functionalists, they're going to say yes. And we'll explore the argument for it and the argument against it in our next lecture.